Welcome to the Tech Blog Writer Podcast, your guide to future tech trends and innovation in a language you understand. Now, over to your host, Neil Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Blog Writer Podcast. How are we doing, gang? Sometimes I have to pinch myself and wonder if this is all just some part of some crazy dream, because to be able to talk directly to each and every one of you in 165 countries every day is an honour and a privilege on its own. But when you also throw in getting to speak directly with inspirational people from all over the world and how tech is making a real difference and improving lives on this tiny planet of ours, well, to be honest, it doesn't get much better than that. Now, today's guest is the CEO of a company called SyncThink, and that's a neurotechnology company with a foundational IP in eye tracking. Her name is Laura Yecies, and she's a Silicon Valley veteran that has successfully led multiple startups and top brands. In fact, if I was to list all of her achievements, it would take up an entire show today. For example, as someone that remembers the browser wars and Netscape Navigator very fondly, Laura is particularly exciting to this aging geek because of her time as Vice President of the Netscape browser division at AOL, where she was responsible for the development of Netscape 7.0 and the launch of Netscape Browser in 23 different languages. And even after leaving Netscape, she joined Yahoo and served as the Global General Manager for Yahoo Mail. But it doesn't stop there. She was previously the CEO of two venture-backed startups as well. As CEO of SugarSync, she led the company for 4 years through an aggressive business and product growth phase, growing from $0 to $25 million in revenue. And when SugarSync was later acquired by J2 Global, she joined Catch.com, where they expanded the product footprint and built strategic alliances before successfully selling the company to Apple in 2013. But as cool as all that is, I've not invited her on today to talk about her past, but I want to talk about where she's heading and the exciting role she's playing in the technology industry right now. And in particular, I want to talk about her incredibly exciting adventure with SyncThink. SyncThink develops revolutionary eye-tracking technology analytics inside of VR headsets that give medical professionals objective metrics for visual attention and dynamic orientation. Based on 15 years of research and 12 granted patents, SyncThink's first product, iSync, is a 60-second objective sideline assessment that uses eye tracking to evaluate for ocular motor impairments and vestibular ocular dysfunction. Although we don't always associate it, concussion happens in almost every sport on a regular basis, and that's why today's topic is so important. There are already so many heated debates about concussion protocol that has happened within football and around the NFL. But it's also in wrestling, baseball, basketball, and like I said, almost any sport that you can name. So I invited Laura on the show today to not only talk about SyncThink, but how eye synchronization technology and virtual reality can screen athletes for impairments. And not only that, they often find them in a mere 60 seconds. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to California so we can speak with Laura Yecies, the CEO of SyncThink. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name is Laura Yecies. I'm the CEO of a medical technology company called SyncThink, and we provide technology that helps clinicians diagnose brain health conditions. We've most recently been working with a lot of clinics and teams where they use our device to detect a visual prediction problem. It's called ocular motor dysfunction, and that can be an important input in ascertaining if a player is fatigued or if they have a concussion. And then in the future, we're working on using our device for a number of other important brain health conditions.
I think when a lot of people think of sport, they don't automatically think of concussion, and they don't automatically think of technology either. So can you just tell everyone listening exactly what SyncThink is and the incredibly important problem that it's tackling through technology?
Well, first let me start talking about the device itself.
Yeah.
So the way our technology works is we provide a visual stimulus, a predictable stimulus that the user has to follow with their eyes. It's all done within a VR headset. So we use a Samsung Gear VR headset. We specially outfit that headset with a high quality eye tracking camera system. So we, at 60 frames per second, can read the exact location of your eye. And if your eye is accurately following the stimulus, it can, in our case, it's a light going in a circle, but we actually have expanded to do multiple different stimuli. And you might ask, well, why does that matter? Why does it matter if I can follow a light in a pattern, in a predictable pattern? Well, it turns out that, as they say, the eyes are the windows to the brain. And your ability to predict and coordinate between your eyes and something moving turns out to be a very good predictor of the state of your brain health. So the reason for that is, for us to operate in the world, we have to predict. So, for instance, if you want to hit a tennis ball, if you wait till the ball is right in front of you and then swing, you'll miss, right? Your body needs time to do that motion, and your brain even needs time to process. So in order to react at the right time, you have to predict. You have to look at the trajectory of the ball and figure out how fast it's going. And that's a pretty complicated thing, and only primates can do that, actually. And elite athletes do it very well. And regular people also do it pretty well. You wouldn't be able to drive a car if you couldn't do this type of prediction. Well, it turns out when we have certain brain health conditions, we are not as good at doing that prediction. And the way you can measure that is with this simple test, where we give you, something to watch that's predictable. So for instance, if I draw 20% of a circle, you know how to finish that circle. If I did it with pencil, you could draw the rest of it, because we know what circles look like. And so if you can't do that with the right timing and the right accuracy, it could be an indication that there's something wrong. And the origin of this technology was from about 10 years ago, after the Iraq War. The Department of Defense, the U.S., saw that we had a huge number of concussions. I think over 300,000 veterans had concussions, and they didn't have a good way to diagnose them in the field. And so the DoD funded a few companies, including SyncThink, to try to find a mobile, objective, fast, and accurate way to diagnose concussions. And there was a lot of research and different approaches. In the early days, the company was making these prototype helmets. But as the VR and AR world started to become more mainstream, and we started to have lower cost off-the-shelf devices, it became clear that we could use our research and analytics and deploy that within commercially available technology. And that's what we've been doing for the last year.
Fantastic. So I'm fascinated by the technology that you're using here. I understand you've got the VR headset and you put that on, but how does eye synchronization actually detect, in particular, concussion?
Okay, so I talked about this ability to predict, or this need to predict. So imagine the light is going around in a circle at a predictable speed because you see the light start. Well, it turns out there's a very specific, consistent signal with concussion where the eyes jump ahead. Okay? And what's going on is this whole prediction mechanism is slightly off. The synchronization is off. That's why we call it eye sync. The timing is off. The eyes are actually jumping ahead. So when we do the readout from this pattern, in our analysis, we're measuring the deviation from the location of this dot. When we do that readout, you see these forward saccades where the eye keeps on jumping ahead and then goes back and jumps ahead and goes back. So it becomes a very clear visual result. And what we also see is that over time, the person recovers. We have a normative database of over 10,000 subjects. So we know what, let's say, a normal result is for different ages. And when we see this, this abnormal result, we can realize that there's a problem. Now, to be clear, our device doesn't make a diagnosis. Our device gives you objective data, just like, a glucometer gives you a blood sugar reading, but the doctor says if you have diabetes, or, you might get a blood pressure reading. and then the doctor says if you have high blood pressure, need to take medicine. Same thing for our device. We give the doctor this objective measure. And the idea of looking at the eyes and eye tracking is not completely new. So I don't know if you've ever seen a doctor examine a patient or a trainer look at an athlete at the sideline and you see them hold their fingers up, and they ask them to follow their finger, right? So this has been a kind of clinical practice for a long time. But as you can imagine, these high-end cameras operating at 60 frames per second are much more accurate than a clinician looking at your eyes following their finger.
I suppose we must make this clear again, really, that this kind of technology is not replacing doctors. It's actually giving them tools to enhance their decision-making and remove inefficiencies, isn't it?
Yes, and one of the most I think important issues, and one of the reasons why I'm so excited about this technology, is that the neurological space as a kind of general field is lacking objective tests. So, for the other parts of the body, the heart, the bones, we have very good objective tests. But for the, milder but still significant brain health conditions like concussion, like early Alzheimer's, like ADHD, there aren't really objective measurements. I don't know if you've ever had, someone that get evaluated for ADHD. They fill out surveys. The parent or teacher will describe the child's behavior, but there's not a reading with a number. It's very subjective. Same thing for early dementia, right? Is the person maybe slightly more forgetful? Well, we all get slightly more forgetful with age. There's no MRI to pick up early dementia. There's no other objective tests. So the whole neurological field in general has really this crying need for objective measurements, and those really are to support the clinicians.
So I think technology then, it's not just about concussion. You can use it for ADHD and early onset Alzheimer's?
So we're in the research phase for ADHD and Alzheimer's as well as Parkinson's. But we are in use and with tremendous amounts of published clinical data, over 30 published papers for concussion as well as fatigue. So interestingly, when this early research was done for the military, and they started to see this signal for concussion, the first question the researchers asked was, well, could this signal be mistaken for something else? If a soldier is just sleep deprived, which of course happens in battle, right? And it happens to all of us increasingly, would that get confused? Well, it turns out that the fatigue signal is different. So for concussion, we have this timing issue I mentioned with the eyes jumping ahead. In concussion, we're sort of disinhibited, which, by the way, if you've ever known someone to have a concussion, oftentimes they're emotionally disinhibited as well, so it's consistent. But with fatigue, we see a different type of error. The eye is above, there's basically a radial error, X, Y, off of the target. So their timing is fine. Their accuracy is, in terms of the location, is not as good. And this was tested at Natick Army Base outside of Boston, where they sleep-deprived soldiers. And they had normal eye tracking, and then they sleep-deprived them. And then they had this particular eye tracking problem. And so right now, our athletic customers are using the product actively to measure fatigue. So, there's been a lot of studies in the sports world that, when the teams, for instance, are on the road, they don't, they lose more. And, some of that there's a home field advantage, but some of that is actually fatigue. So right now the Golden State Warriors, who as a Bay Area fan are excited to say that they're the NBA champions, they have been using the product for a year, and they test their players at least weekly, their fatigue level.
So just for anyone listening, why is there a need for this technology as such, do you think? And also, what is the importance of objective measures?
Well, let's look at the converse. What if you don't have objective measures, right? We know young people are oftentimes affected by concussions. So teenagers, young adults, athletes. And, it's common that at that age of life, people think that they're invincible. We know that there's cumulative harm done by repeat concussions. And so if you have only subjective tests and the clinician is asking, the player, how do you feel? You see that they took a big hit. Oh, I feel fine. I can go out and play. And then, we've heard about repeat concussion syndrome is very dangerous, and, they're repetitive concussions. And then we've also, and we're about to publish a paper on this, seen that if someone has abnormal eye tracking, they are more than twice as likely to sustain a musculoskeletal injury, right? And it's kind of makes sense. If you can't follow a dot in a circle, how are you going to protect yourself? How will you perform well in sport? So, but really from a long-term health point of view, the lack of objective tools, I think, has meant a lot of under and misdiagnoses.
Now, obviously, we've talked about the military and hinted about the NFL a little bit, but how's it being used, or how do you see it being used in the field, and who by?
Yeah, so right now we have over 30 customers. We have a number of clinics, so Mass General, Stanford, Previa Sports Clinic, Tanner Concussion Clinic. They're using the product actively. And then we have over 20 college teams. So the Pac-12, which is one of the big sports NCAA conferences in the U.S., University of Georgia, Georgia Tech. We have a couple of other smaller teams, the pro teams I mentioned, the Golden State Warriors. So we're actively selling the product for the last year and getting increasing usage. We had over 1,000 tests done with our product in the first 2 weeks of August.
So just for anyone listening that's unfamiliar with this world, I just want to take them back in time a little bit before SyncThink. And how were doctors able to detect and analyse concussions, just to help them visualise really just how far this technology is the way to detect concussion?
Let's go back, maybe a little ways back. So let's say 20, 25 years ago, you'd see a player take a hit. Let's assume that they did not lose consciousness. You bring them off, talk to them, see if they make sense, ask them to count backwards, by sevens from 100 or, some type of simple cognitive test, ask if they can see how many fingers you have. And if they say they're okay, they go back in. And then recognizing that there was a big gap, people started to develop cognitive tests where, you would do a baseline test of the player, at the beginning of the season, and then test them if they sustained a possible, injury. There have also been some more rigorous testing of, let's say, balance, looking for ocular motor distortion, but that's just looking visually. So there are a few standard tests. One's called the SCAT-5 that's commonly used, the BESS. So there are a few different clinical tests. But what it comes down to is you have subjective measures where you're asking the player how they feel, you're seeing how they look to you, and then you have a cognitive test, which sounds like it's objective, but the problem is, and this was just published in the Washington Post, 50% of kids fake their baseline because they don't want to have to leave the game. So they are deliberately underperforming on the baseline test. And the cognitive tests don't work without a baseline because, of course, there's tremendous variability in the population on cognition. So one of the benefits of the SyncThink test that's objective is that we actually don't even require a baseline. We recommend a baseline because oftentimes elite athletes have, above average eye tracking. But our test functions without a baseline, and you can't fake it. You can't learn it. The cognitive tests, have a learning effect and less than 50% retest reliability. So the state of the art, previously has been, relatively inaccurate and highly subjective.
So looking to the future then, what's next for SyncThink? Is there anything else that you can share with us about your future plans and where you would see it being used in the sporting area and beyond?
Yeah, so we're very aggressively taking our measurement to help sports improve performance. So we think of brain health as really a continuum of performance. So an athlete, will have a baseline. You might see that they have good eye tracking, but could be better. Maybe part of their visual field isn't as good. And so they can do vision training. And then we monitor them. We monitor their fatigue and we monitor for injury. And, we are starting to provide training to help people improve. Another big effort for us is in terms of scouting. So you can imagine especially the skill sports like cricket or baseball or tennis, where eye tracking is a core part of performance in the sport. And so we're starting to have teams use our technology for scouting purposes to have that be one of the metrics that they assess with potential athletes. I'm sure you followed this is true for pro football in Europe and the pro sports in the U.S., the athletes are getting tremendous contracts, tremendously expensive contracts. So the teams are very interested in putting any useful technology to work to make sure that, that the players are going to be able to perform well. So, one major initiative is taking our technology from just the injury and injury prevention area into, rehabilitation and performance. We're also working on making our technology available on off-the-shelf AR systems. So right now we customize the headset, as I mentioned, with the eye trackers, but in the future will be available on off-the-shelf AR systems. We're partnering with some major developers there. And then finally, we're doing clinical trials to expand our indications. So we have very deep repositories of data for fatigue and concussion, and we're working on expanding our data for some of these other indications that we talked about earlier.
Now, before I let you go, though, we do have quite a few listeners from the startup community listening to us today, and the war for talent, both in the Valley and all over the world, is fierce. But I've heard that you give some fantastic advice on another podcast about how to recruit and interview for startups. So to all the startup founders listening, what advice would you pass on when recruiting and interviewing for their own startup?
Sure. Well, I spent the first 20 years of my career working for big companies and then the last 10 years almost in startups. And so, of course, universally, you need to make sure that you have a skill match, right? But what's different about startups is, you have to really make sure that there's a shared vision. So sharing your vision of the company and then trying to understand what that employee or potential employee's vision is, because startups are hard. All of work is hard, but startups are especially hard. And there's nothing that you can do, I believe, on a day-to-day basis to solve a lack of shared vision problem. So I think that's really important. And we're very fortunate that the problems that we're working on are things that are motivating to some really great engineers and clinicians in the Valley. The other thing I would say is, I believe so strongly in having, diverse experiences, diverse, not just gender and race, but, diversity of thought, because when you're a small startup, you don't have as many people to interact with. And so, a lot of your idea generation is going to come from the richness of the discussions and debates that you have internally. And so it's very tempting in startups, especially early stage startups, to bring some of your former colleagues and friends around. And I think a couple of former colleagues is great, but it's very important to mix it up. And I'm really enjoying that part of my work at SyncThink.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think diversity of thought is so important. It's so often underestimated, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Well, because you don't know what you don't know, right? Yeah. It's hard to figure out, to compensate for those gaps.
Well, a huge thank you for coming on today. But finally, can I just ask that you remind the listeners of where they can find you online and also contact a member of your team if they've just got any questions at all about the conversation we started today?
Absolutely. So our website is SyncThink, SyncThink.com. And you can contact us at info@syncthink.com. And we have a blog there as well as a lot of product information. And I also maintain a personal blog where I comment on some of these topics as well. And you can see that at my name, laurayecies.com.
Fantastic. I can't thank you enough for coming on today, because we all know about sports and know about concussion, but I've never put technology into that and thought how technology could actually help that situation. So it's so easy to see why SyncThink is a leading neurotechnology company, but it's that foundational IP and eye tracking metrics and devices that is incredibly exciting. I'm sure you're in for an incredibly exciting ride moving forward and really making a difference too. So a big thank you for coming on today.
Thank you, Neil.
After over 600 episodes, I love how I'm still surprised and given the wow factor on a daily basis. Because when you think of concussion in sport, you don't associate the problem or the solution to that problem with technology. But it's the emergence of technologies such as SyncThink that are now assisting doctors in diagnosis determinations that until recently were made by just a doctor's judgment alone. So with SyncThink and iSync specifically, it flips that dynamic on its head, giving doctors only objective data, like Laura said a few moments ago. And essentially this helps staff and doctors use that data to screen for problems and tell an athlete and the coach if there is an issue, even when the player inevitably says that there isn't a problem and they're fine to go on. How valuable is that? We keep hearing these scary stories of how technology is removing jobs and crazy things like AI or technology will replace the doctor. Technology is not replacing doctors. It's giving them the tools to enhance their decision making and remove inefficiencies, not just put up with them. That has to be a great thing, doesn't it? Over to you. Let me know. As always, I'm always fascinated by your thoughts on today's episode and indeed any of our recent conversations. So email me techblogwriter@outlook.com or tweet me at Neil C. Hughes. So if you're a medical professional, athlete, or in fact from any walk of life, I'd love for you to share what you've taken away from today's episode. But I'm afraid it's time for me to go now. But a big thank you for listening as always, and until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thanks for listening to the Tech Blog Writer Podcast. Until next time, remember, technology is best when it brings people together.